Well, thank you, Meta. And what a great pleasure and honor it is to be here. I'm just deeply, deeply honored to be invited to speak at an event celebrating Doug Roche's 21st book. You know, Doug strikes me as the epitome of the kind of person that we pay far too little attention to in the media. And that is a person who is deeply committed and concerned and fighting to do something about injustice, fighting for the public good, and who has entered public life, who has in fact been an elected member of parliament, a senator, Canada's ambassador for disarmament to the UN. This is the kind of public-spirited individual that we frankly see too little of today. And maybe just to illustrate this, I thought I would pose a little skill testing question to you. I'm going to name 4 names, and I want you to figure out which one doesn't belong in with the others. Okay? Patrick Brazeau, Mike Duffy, Douglas Roche, and Pamela Wallin. I'm guessing that you will all have figured out these are all senators, or all former conservative senators to be more specific, but the one least likely to be found in an RCMP lineup, as we know, is Doug Roche. And partly, I guess, what I want to say is just how Doug, in many ways, you know, typifies and it really illustrates how, well, just on one level, just how sadly the Conservative Party in this country has been transformed. That one day, it used to be able to make room for people like Doug Roche and David MacDonald, Joe Clark, Robert Stanfield, some truly outstanding public-spirited Canadians. And yet it's been transformed into this abomination under Stephen Harper. And part of that, again, you know, Doug reminds us of the transformation of the abandonment of the embrace of peace. I mean, governments are always slow to embrace peace and quick to embrace war, but that has become ever more pronounced under the Harper Conservatives. I mean, the celebration of the culture of war, you know, the pumping up of our military budget. You know, I saw something the other day. Of course, there's the whole F-35 warplane that we're going to get at some point. It's kind of off the front burner right now because we have an election coming up, and they've pushed it off till after the election. But I saw something the other day that was pointing out that in the Harper government's description of what they need in that plane, you know, that they're going to buy, they describe it as a plane with the capacity to fight for state-to-state fighting for an extended period of time. I mean, this sounds like all-out war that they're preparing for. And I think it's so important in that context that Doug takes us back to a focus on peace, as he has in all of his works. And I love this work. Meta, I actually have read it, and I can tell you it's an excellent and inspiring book because it raises that profound question about how can we make this a world free of war? And actually argues, I think quite persuasively, that there are constructive steps that have been taken in that direction. I'm going to let Doug explain it more. But to me, that is such an exciting and profound and important question that we never address. I mean, there's a tendency always to consider war as some inevitable thing we just have to put up with. Whereas in fact, war is an institution. War is an institution that requires a lot of infrastructure and it requires a lot of public support. I mean, people have compared it to slavery, for instance, another institution that for centuries had, you know, public approval, And then after the abolition movement kind of made it no longer socially acceptable to keep slaves, and we changed all our laws and everything. Now, today, nobody would think of keeping a slave in any kind of civilized society. It's the same thing with war. It's the same thing with war. And if that doesn't sound true, I mean, I always look to the example of Western Europe. Western Europe, that for centuries, the Germans and the French and the English were always fighting each other, and that was the norm. And then, after the hideous bloodbath of the Second World War, all that changed. And there was no longer a social approval, no longer a tolerance for going to war with other Western European nations. And today, we have different set of institutions, and one can no longer even imagine, a German politician advocating, let's invade France. I mean, it would be considered positively loopy to make a suggestion like that. And war, similarly, this is not an inevitable fact of human nature. Rather, it is a social construct, and it requires social approval. It's an institution that requires social approval. And what Doug reminds us so powerfully of is that everywhere, the truth is, people yearn for peace, and people struggle, and people work for peace. And it's really only a very small group, small, powerful group of business and political leaders, the famous military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, that are always wanting to redirect us onto war. One of the things I really liked towards the end of the book, Doug talks about the importance of leadership, and he talks about the difference between transactional leadership, I think it was, and transformative leadership. Transactional leadership, if I remember, was, when a political leader tries to get your vote, in an exchange, then he promises lower taxes. Whereas transformative leadership is a leader that's willing to actually lead towards a goal, lead the public towards a goal of championing an important cause for the public good. And I guess I just want to say that I'm so thrilled to be here, because to me, Doug Roche, more than anyone I can think of, represents that kind of transformative leadership that we so badly need. So thanks a lot.
Well, Doug Roche is someone who needs no introduction, but he's worthy of getting 2 introductions. And I have an honor of saying a few words about Doug. He's written about peacemakers in this book, but he forgot someone who's very well qualified to be in that book, and that is himself. And one day, although Doug thinks that his career as an author is finished, I think we still want and need a memoir from him, another one after Creative Dissent, and after his memoir about his time in politics. Doug had a career that spanned 5 different sectors, and 5 different major positions, and in all of these he was a peacemaker. He was a journalist who was very much influenced by what he saw in the field in Africa and elsewhere, and that we can both see in his authorship later on, in being such a great writer, but also being able to have that sense of compassion, being able to understand that there are people in the world who are not nearly as fortunate as us, and we have to do something to help them. And he went on to be editor and journalist, and in that early phase, and then member of Parliament as a sign of his commitment. And dealt with many of the controversial issues of the day, and in that brought his own activism and his own peacemaking. Then it was only natural that Moroni appointed him as our disarmament ambassador, Canada's disarmament ambassador. And I remember very well him in that capacity in New York, chairing the Disarmament Commission and bringing forward the very important 16 principles of verification when the Soviet Union was just opening up, and this was a way to encourage them. In fact, the Soviet Union, to everyone's surprise, said, yes, we want verification, whereas they'd been hiding behind a cloak of secrecy for so long. And then George Shultz, the Secretary of State at the time, said, well, how can we say no to our own proposals? But sure enough, the United States did. They said no, and they didn't want the kind of openness that Doug was promoting back in 1987-88 as disarmament ambassador, and then also leading Canada in the General Assembly Special Session on Disarmament and Development, and two issues that brought together matters that are very dear to Doug's heart, and the importance. If the world is going to actually bring about development, it has to give up its addiction to arms. The $1.7 trillion, how that dwarfs the amount we spend on development. It's around 70 billion. 1.7 trillion versus 70 billion in official development assistance, and how we have to reverse those priorities. And Doug has been working as a peacemaker throughout his career, as journalist, as member of parliament, as then disarmament ambassador, and then as senator. So it was Jean Chrétien who appointed Doug, knowing his capacities. And Doug told me at one point that he said to Jean Chrétien that he would accept, but he wanted to continue doing his disarmament activism. And Jean Chrétien said, fine, go right ahead. So we had this conservative, progressive conservative, back at a time when the Conservative Party was actually progressive, being appointed by a Liberal Prime Minister. And we had someone who was a voice for peace in the Senate. And then Doug had to retire. I mean, at that young age of, 84 years old, when you have to retire from the... so 75, I should say. 75, retire from the Canadian Senate. And then Doug went on. Well, throughout this, he'd been working in civil society. He'd been the founding president of Parliamentarians for Global Action. He was with the Global Education Associates. And he was very active in trying to bring up the grassroots so that they would have a voice. And then also the experts. As chairman of Canadian Pugwash, he was an inspiration to all of us, and had managed the joy of serving for over a decade under his chairmanship of Canadian Pugwash. And then Doug kept on this activism afterwards. He just wrote book after book, and when I sort of had thinking that after several years I'd be able to finalize my one book that I've been planning on for the last decade, Doug had come out with 3 or 4 more. And I once asked him, what was his secret for producing so much work? And he said, swimming. He loves going for swimming. He helps keep up his attitude. And also, he's an early bird, and I'm a night owl, so I have lots of admiration for him, how he can get up early in the morning and do his writing and produce these wonderful books. So as an activist and author, he kept up this contribution to peacemaking. And we're about to get a little treat tonight, because he'll talk about peacemaking, and he'll talk about this wonderful thing, actually the good news that people are contributing to building a world free of war. And as Linda has mentioned, that this is now something that we can treasure, that these people are doing this work. And not only that with the miracle of Europe, there's a great example for how this world can actually be truly free of war. The battlefields of Europe, we're now celebrating or honoring or commemorating, sadly, the tremendous tragedy on the battles between Germany and France, that's now just a complete thing of the past, and that we can see that for the first time in centuries, if not millennia, we have a world in which there are not power blocks that are menacing each other, and that are threatening to launch us into a major war between great powers. And how to capitalize on that so that we actually can create a world free of war, well, that's the job of the peacemakers, and that's why Doug is one of Canada's foremost peacemakers, and that's why we have a treat tonight to hear from him speaking on that subject.
Thank you, Meta. Thank you very much for organizing this event. Walter, thanks for your generous introduction. Linda, I'm one of your chief fans. I tell you, you have a lot of them, and I'm there too, Linda. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate you coming on a rainy night and to share with me this book. Yes, Walter, I did swim today. 2 hours ago I swam, but it doesn't mean there's going to be another book, you know. The important people who are here tonight are Morgan and Nicole, back at the back there, from the Lorimer, my publisher, they're the ones who do the heavy lifting on getting books going. Thanks, Nicole and Morgan. And there's a second Morgan here who's selling the book. We'll have to explain how we got two Morgans here tonight. So yes, Meta, I'm 85, and that's it. A lot of people ask me why I wrote this book. And I say, well, because I'm 85. And I have a lot of experience, and I feel deeply about the issues of peace in the world. I want people to have a feeling of hope, and Linda very neatly encapsulated a lot of my feelings. Thanks, Linda. And now I know that somebody's actually read this book, There are reasons for hope, definitely. Hope is not something that's ephemeral because I feel good on a certain day. That's got nothing to do with it. It's the historical trend lines that we are observing, and that is a basis for hope. And all of us in the peace movement, remember Bill Epstein, God rest him, Bill Epstein said to me, Doug, never quit, because he also got it, that history is moving in our direction. Never doubt it. So I think that this is a moment to stand back for a second and reflect a bit on where we're really going in the world today. The book is called Peacemakers. And although the book was written before the geopolitical crisis caused by Russia's annexation of Crimea, that event illustrates the central theme of the book, namely that people are moving away from war as a means of resolving conflict. Linda referred to that, and I just want to underline it now. Humanity has discovered that war is futile. The rationale and appetite for interstate war are disappearing. That would have seemed impossible in the 20th century, let alone the 19th. So I think that a golden moment in the human journey has arrived, and we ought to note it. I'm not saying that we're all living in harmony, that violence is ended, that suffering is eliminated. I am saying that more people are freed from the physical acts of warfare than ever before. We have not arrived at a destination called peace, but our journey toward that destination is picking up speed. And recognizing that the journey that we're on, it gives us hope for more peaceful conditions, which I'll speak about. Now, I think that there are two factors principally that account for the fact that major countries are pulling back from war. First, the interdependence of virtually every financial and energy system in the world, brought about by the myriad forces of globalization, provides too much benefit to risk being upset by the calamitous consequences of modern warfare. This was especially evident and continues to be evident during the deliberations about Ukraine and how to punish Russia for its action in Crimea. Second, the implementation of human rights in their many aspects has awakened a global conscience, which is leading to multiple efforts to build the conditions for peace. A new generation is coming to maturity with the intuitive understanding of the meaning of human rights in a globalized world. Two powerful themes that are now guiding us: globalization and human rights. War has got no place in this. Now, we know that for centuries, philosophers and prophets have called on us for a higher manifestation of morality and social justice. Such spiritual concepts stood virtually apart from the daily business of governments. But in the past 7 decades, the lifetime, in fact, of the United Nations, and most of my own lifetime, they have entered daily thinking through highly pragmatic political discourse. Much of the UN's activity is directed at repairing the injustices of poverty and the ravages of war and preventing future conflicts. The Millennium Development Goals are an expression of social justice. We still suffer regional forces promoting selfishness, greed, the raw exercise of power. But there's an opposite force, composed of many like-minded governments and civil society, promoting the social global values of tolerance, diversity, and pluralism with fair trade practices. Though the two forces often appear to be at a standoff, for the first time in history, great numbers of civil society are assembling to pressure the powerful to adopt equitable policies on economic development and climate stability. Now, I want to state at the outset what I mean by peace. I do not mean a state of utopia. Rather, I take my cue from Dag Hammarskjöld, the greatest of all the UN Secretaries General, who defined peace in a way that greatly appeals to me. He said, peace is not just a passive state of affairs in a world without war. It is a state of living devoted to action in order to build a world of prosperity and equity where occasions for conflicts either disappear or are quickly challenged if they arise. Peace is a state of action, a state of living devoted to action. A state of living devoted to action. I think this is becoming more evident. Hammarskjöld would welcome the new global civilization that is emerging. The advances in science, medicine, technology, communications, and travel have raised the standards of living everywhere. Between 1990 and 2010, 2 billion people gained access to improved drinking water sources. Rates of child mortality have fallen in all regions of the world in the last 2 decades. More women are literate and educated than ever before, and the education gap with men has shrunken dramatically. A new middle class is rising in Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa is shaking off endemic poverty. Across the world, all the big themes that comprise social intercourse, health, education, commerce, science, energy, shipping, communications, transportation, law, women's rights, all of these are expanding. A UN planning group foresees the eradication of extreme poverty throughout the world by 2030. Is it an accident that this explosion in economic and social development has occurred at a time of declining war? The evidence of the decline of violence is piling up. The professional organizations that study conflict and security issues, such as the Human Security Project of Simon Fraser University and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, produce voluminous charts and statistics showing the decline in the number of wars since the 2 world wars, as well as the Korean and Vietnam wars, which engulfed the 20th century. Of course, civil wars have not ended, and there is yet no guarantee of peace. The world is still spending $1.7 trillion a year on arms, and the continued existence of 17,000 nuclear weapons with the power to cause unimaginable catastrophes are sobering reminders of the precariousness of the concept of peace. But I think it would be irresponsible for us to close our eyes to the effects of new programs to build peace that are found around the world. And in my book, I ask readers, to consider places whose very names conjure up the specter of genocide and mass human suffering in the recent past. Rwanda, Bosnia, Cambodia, Hiroshima, Northern Ireland. In the small East African nation of Rwanda, where about 800,000 people were killed over the span of 100 days in 1994, commerce is beginning to thrive in a stable atmosphere. In Bosnia, Thousands of Muslims were massacred in the worst crime on European soil since World War II. And now the Muslims live in a fragile peace. In Cambodia, where 2 million people died in the killing fields, the international community mounted an effective restoration program, and the country has become a tourist center of South Asia. In Hiroshima, where the first atomic bomb killed 140,000 people outright, the rebuilt, vigorous city is a center of the anti-nuclear weapons campaign. In Northern Ireland, the Troubles, as they're called, that's the fierce and violent clashes between Catholics and Protestants in which 3,500 people were slain, that had been seen as one of the world's intractable conflicts. But today, the people live basically in peace. Queen Elizabeth just shaking hands with the IRA leader. The list of war-torn places that have given way to processes of peace and reconciliation is long. Angola, Ivory Coast, Mozambique, Guatemala, El Salvador, Timor-Leste, Sierra Leone. All of these places have stories of progress to tell in building the conditions for peace. New mechanisms to prevent genocide, improve peacekeeping, peace building, and international justice, many under United Nations auspices, are laboriously being built. This creativity goes largely unreported, and the public seems unaware of the great strides being made in changing the old culture of war into a culture of peace. Isn't it ironic that the world is moving ahead in the understanding of what constitutes human security, and yet we continue to live on the edge of disaster? We are resisting a full political and financial commitment to the mechanisms for peace because we don't know enough about them and certainly lack confidence in them. We need more courage to take the leap to a successful world in which the violence of warfare, mass poverty, and discrimination would be blights of the past. True, we agonize over the deaths, more than 100,000 so far, in Syrian conflict, the atrocities still committed in the Central African Republic, and the continuing suffering of refugees in several areas, lingering zones of conflict, and the seeming inability of the international community to bring combatants everywhere to the peace table preoccupy us. But we should not lose sight that the world as a whole, huge areas of Africa, Asia, Latin America, are entering the most hopeful state of peace in human history. There is no better example of how the world is moving from war to peace than Europe, which suffered through 2 world wars in the 20th century and now basks in the glow of the 2012 Nobel Peace Prize to the European Union. My book outlines the steps needed to further institutionalize the processes of peace. And I give some examples and recommendations, such as a permanent UN peacekeeping force, the reform of the UN Security Council, a nuclear weapons convention, to name just a few. And I look to a highly qualified woman to be the next Secretary General of the United Nations, and I named 4 strong contenders. The best, if not the only way to bring these changes about is through education. The key peace education themes of cooperation, conflict resolution, nonviolence, human rights, social justice, world resources, global environment, and multicultural understanding need to be taught in appropriate ways through the traditional education system, from nursery school to postdoctoral programs, and also in the work of civil society organizations around the world. New thinking for the protection and development of the human community is taking form. It's a moment of astonishing change in the history of the world. The Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, the marches against war are only the opening notes. Humanity is discovering a power it never had before to construct a more peaceful world. I hope that you'll enjoy the book. Thanks a lot.